The use of have to in the present.
We use the two words have to together to express certain ideas. In the affirmative, have to indicates an obligation or a requirement. For example, I have to exercise every day indicates that this is an obligation, that the person is required to do this. In the negative, have to usually indicates the lack of an obligation, or sometimes it can indicate an option, an alternative, a possibility. So the electrician does not have to change the switch. That is, the electrician is not obliged, it's not required to change the switch, but he or she may decide to do so. So in the negative, it's not as strong. In the negative, it sometimes has the sense that it's an option. In the affirmative, however, it is strong and there is no option. Negative versus affirmative sentences with have to. We get the subject, then in the affirmative, we get no auxiliary, and of course, there's no word not. Then we get have to or has to, the main verb, and the rest of the sentence. So we get, for example, you have to call your mother. His cousin has to study for a test. Because his cousin is what we call third person singular, it refers to he or she, then we use the form has instead of have. In the negative, to form the negative, we need to add the auxiliary do or does before we place the word not, because the word not must go after an auxiliary or the verb be. So since there is no auxiliary, we put in one. Whenever we need an auxiliary and there is no auxiliary, we use do or does in the present. So we get this, the students, auxiliary do, then the negative not, then have to go to the activity. Another example, Nancy does not have to work next Saturday. Right? Notice that when we put the es on does, we do not use it again on have. So if you have does, then you have to use have to after that. Okay. In the affirmative, have to indicates an obligation or requirement. In the negative, it indicates a lack of obligation, and therefore sometimes it indicates something is uh, optional. So in the sentence, the students do not have to go to the activity, they are not required to go, but they have the option to go if they would like there. In yes/no questions, we begin with the auxiliary do. There may be some material before that, but the important thing is to have do or does, then the subject, then have to, the main verb, and the rest of the sentence. So, for example, we get do you have to call your mother? Does his cousin have to study for a test? Do we have to go to the activity? And again, when you are referring to what we call the third person singular, he or she or it, then we use the form does instead of do. When answering these questions, if you answer in the affirmative, we get yes, I, you, he, she, it, etc. Do or does, depending on the uh, the pronoun used. In the negative, no, I don't, no, he doesn't, there. So that in the short answer to these questions, we get yes or no. Then we get usually a pronoun, I, you, he, she, it. Then we get either do or does, and if the answer is in the negative, we get either don't or doesn't there, since we generally use the auxiliary in the short answer. Forming information questions with have to is similar to forming yes no questions. But in information questions, we need a question word like when, where, why, or sometimes we get a phrase like how many, what followed by a noun such what book. So sometimes it's one word, but sometimes that question position is filled by more than one word. So we get this question word or phrase. Then we need an auxiliary, either do or does, followed by the subject. Then we get have to, then the main verb and the rest of the sentence. So, for example, when do you have to call your mother? Why does his cousin have to study for a test? Where do we have to go for the activity? How many exercises does the boxer have to do? The order of words is very important because in English, the main way to indicate a question is by the order of the words. In both yes no questions and most information questions, we get the auxiliary do, then we get the subject, and then have to and the main verb. This order tells the person who's listening or reading that that particular sentence is a question. I hope that this short explanation of can and have to will help you. I know you can't remember all of this information, but I'm hoping that this information will help clarify some things and maybe help you progress a little bit more in your acquisition of English.